A luxury car dealership manager refused to sell an expensive SUV to a black man, only to discover he was the owner. The afternoon sun blazed over Buckhead, one of Atlanta's wealthiest districts. Towering glass buildings reflected the golden light, and the streets buzzed with the low hum of high-end cars gliding past. Inside Hamilton Prestige Motors, a dealership renowned for serving the elite, Madeline Burke stood behind a sleek mahogany desk, her gaze sweeping across the showroom like a queen overseeing her kingdom. At 47, she had spent nearly 20 years mastering the art of luxury auto sales. More than just a manager, she considered herself a gatekeeper, ensuring that only those who truly belonged drove away in the gleaming vehicles displayed under the bright showroom lights. She prided herself on recognizing status, wealth, and who fit the mold, or who didn't. The soft chime of the entrance bell drew her attention. A man stepped inside, tall, broad-shouldered, seemingly in his mid-40s. He wore a simple navy hoodie, dark jeans, and a pair of worn-out sneakers. His stance was casual, his expression unreadable, as his eyes scanned the pristine showroom floor, the lineup of luxury SUVs, and the awards mounted on the walls. Madeline took one look at him and made up her mind. Not a buyer. She turned slightly toward Greg, one of her sales associates, who had been watching the man curiously. "Don't waste your time," she murmured, adjusting the diamond bracelet on her wrist. "He's just browsing." Greg hesitated but said nothing. He had worked with Madeline long enough to know that when she made a judgment call, no one questioned it. But the man wasn't just looking. He walked straight toward a 2024 Range Rover autobiography, pausing beside the driver's side door, running his fingers along the sleek black finish. He took in every detail before turning toward Madeline. Their eyes met, and without hesitation, he strode in her direction. "Excuse me," he said, his voice calm yet direct. "I'm interested in that Range Rover. I'd like to learn more about it." Madeline barely contained her sigh. She had seen this before. Men who wandered in, hoping for a joyride in a car they could never afford. She forced a tight smile. "That's the autobiography edition," she said, her tone clipped. "Fully loaded, top-tier luxury, $165,000. The man nodded. "Sounds like what I'm looking for." Madeline folded her arms. "Are you aware of our financing policies? A purchase of that size requires either a substantial credit score or full upfront payment." The man's gaze remained steady, unreadable. "I won't need financing." She let out a light chuckle. "I see. Well, if you're serious, we'll need to run a soft credit check before proceeding. It's company policy." Greg shifted uncomfortably. They both knew that wasn't company policy. But the man didn't flinch. No irritation, no pushback. Instead, he simply reached into his pocket and pulled out a sleek black card holder. "I'd like to test drive it." Madeline's expression tightened. "We don't allow test drives on vehicles at that price point without verified proof of income," she said smoothly. "I'm sure you understand." The man's lips curled slightly, as if he had expected this response. "Oh, I understand." But Madeline had no idea what was coming next. Greg shifted beside her, uneasily. He had seen Madeline pull this move before, subtly weeding out those who didn't fit their clientele. But something about this man felt different. He didn't get defensive. He didn't argue. He just watched. Madeline, however, held her ground. "I'm sorry," she said, keeping her smile polite yet distant. "But for a vehicle of that caliber, we only entertain serious inquiries. We've had issues in the past, people wasting our time, taking joyrides and walking away." The man didn't react. "Joyriding?" "It's nothing personal," she added quickly, though the forced politeness in her tone made it clear it was. "I'm sure you understand." Greg caught it then. The smallest shift in the man's expression, a flicker of something beneath his calm demeanor, Not anger, not frustration. Something colder, sharper. But just as quickly as it appeared, it was gone. The man exhaled through his nose, nodding slowly. "All right, no test drive. Got it." Madeline gave a satisfied nod and was already turning her attention toward a different customer, an older gentleman in a tailored suit, eyeing a Bentley across the showroom. But before she could dismiss the conversation entirely, the man in the hoodie spoke again. "What about cash buyers?" She glanced back, slightly irritated. "Excuse me?" "If someone wanted to pay in full, no financing, no credit check, would that change your test drive policy?" Madeline almost laughed. People like him didn't buy six-figure cars in cash. They didn't just walk in off the street and drop that kind of money, at least not the ones she expected to. "I appreciate your enthusiasm," she said, her voice sickly sweet. "But I'm sure you understand why we have policies in place." For the first time, a hint of amusement crossed the man's face. "I see." He slid his hands into his pockets. "So, what would it take?" Madeline's smile tightened. "I just told you," she said, her patience beginning to wear thin. "We require proof of serious intent. Our vehicles are highly sought after, and we can't have—" "I understand," the man interrupted, his tone eerily calm. "I'm just trying to figure out where the bar is. What does a serious customer look like to you?" Silence. For the first time, Greg saw something flicker in Madeline's expression. A brief pause, so small it was almost imperceptible. Then, just as quickly, she masked it with a short, dismissive laugh. "I think we're done here," she said crisply. "If you'd like to browse, feel free, but I have other customers to attend to." Greg expected the man to argue, maybe even storm out. But he didn't. Instead, he just nodded, the corner of his mouth twitching upward in something that wasn't quite a smile. "Understood." And just like that, he turned and walked away. But there was something about the way he moved, slow, deliberate, almost calculating, that left Greg with an uneasy feeling. Madeline had just made a mistake. Greg couldn't shake the sense that something was off. The man wasn't upset. He wasn't embarrassed. He wasn't even flustered. Instead, he carried himself like someone who had just learned something important, like someone waiting for the perfect moment to act. Greg's eyes flicked to Madeline, who had already moved on, flashing her most polished smile at the older man admiring the Bentley, business as usual. But across the showroom, the man in the hoodie hadn't left. Instead, he was casually inspecting another vehicle, a Mercedes-Benz G-Class, running his fingers along the chrome handle, tilting his head slightly, as if admiring it. Greg watched as Jared, one of the junior salesmen, hesitated before stepping forward. "Hey there, sir," Jared greeted, flashing his most practiced salesman's grin. "Need any help with that one?" The man turned to face him, expression unreadable. "Yeah, actually, I was looking at the Range Rover earlier, but I was told test drives are off limits unless I prove I'm serious. That true?" Jared blinked. Well, I mean..." Before he could stumble through an answer, Madeline appeared beside him like a shadow. Her lips still carried that polished, professional smile, but her eyes were sharp. "Jared, I'll take it from here." Jared looked like he wanted to protest, but one glance at Madeline and he backed off, disappearing toward the reception desk. The man watched the exchange with quiet amusement. "You sure do keep a tight leash on your employees," he mused, but Madeline didn't engage. "I thought I made myself clear," she said smoothly. "We cater to a specific clientele, and we can't accommodate every request." A brief silence followed, before the man chuckled softly, shaking his head. "You know, I've been to a lot of dealerships," he said, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. "Some good, some bad, but I've never seen someone work this hard not to sell me a car." Madeline's expression hardened. "That's not what's happening here." The man tilted his head slightly. "Then let's make it simple. I'll write a check right now. Full amount, no financing, no games, just business." Greg, who had been pretending not to listen from behind the desk, felt his stomach tighten. Madeline stared at the man for a long moment, her fingers twitching slightly at her sides. She wasn't stupid. If he really was a cash buyer, turning him away outright could backfire. But she wasn't convinced, and she wasn't about to be proven wrong in front of her team. "That's a generous offer," she said, her voice velvety smooth. "But as I mentioned, company policy requires documentation before we can proceed." The man held her gaze for a beat. Then, slowly, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet. Flipping it open, he revealed a black American Express Centurion card. Greg's eyes widened. Madeline didn't move. The man let the silence linger, allowing her to process what she was seeing. Then, just as slowly, he tucked the card back into his pocket. "No test drive, huh?" he finally said, his voice laced with something Greg couldn't quite pinpoint. Madeline lifted her chin, her professional mask still firmly in place. "I'm afraid not." The man studied her for another long moment, then, without another word, turned and walked away. Greg saw it. The realization settling in, Madeline had just made a critical mistake. The silence in the showroom was heavy. Madeline stood stiffly, her jaw tight, hands clasped in front of her. She had just dismissed a man carrying a Centurion card, the kind reserved for ultra-high-net-worth individuals, and still refused to sell to him. Greg swallowed hard. That didn't look good. Across the showroom, the man didn't storm out. He didn't seem rattled in the slightest. Instead, he took his time, strolling past the rows of high-end cars as if he owned the place. His fingers trailed along the polished hoods, his head nodding slightly, almost like he was taking mental notes. Then, the glass doors swung open. A sharply dressed man in his mid-50s stepped inside. Graying hair, a tailored navy suit, an air of authority. Greg's stomach dropped. Elliot Gaines, regional director, Madeline saw him too. She straightened immediately, her entire demeanor shifting. "Mr. Gaines," she greeted, her tone light, professional. "What a pleasant surprise. What brings you in today?" But Elliot barely glanced at her. His eyes locked onto the man in the hoodie instead. And then, to Greg's shock, his face broke into a wide smile. "There he is!" Elliot strode forward, hand outstretched. "Jordan!" "I was just about to call you." The air in the room shifted. Madeline's face went pale. The man, Jordan, finally cracked a small smile and shook Elliot's hand with an easy familiarity. "Good to see you, Elliot," he said smoothly. "I was just having a look around." Elliot chuckled, clapping him on the shoulder. "I told you, this is one of our best locations. You'll love it here." Greg swore he saw the exact moment the truth hit Madeline. Her posture went rigid, her breath shallow. "Wait," she said, her voice suddenly quieter, more cautious. "You know each other?" Elliot blinked, finally looking at her. "Of course," he said. Then, with a broad grin, gestured toward Jordan. "Meet Jordan Ellis, the new CEO of Hamilton Prestige Motors." The words landed like a bomb. Greg didn't move. No one did. Except Madeline. Her lips parted slightly, but no words came out. Her entire body locked up. Jordan simply watched her, his expression unreadable. Then he exhaled through his nose, slipping his hands into his pockets. "Miss Burke," he said evenly, "you just refused to sell a car to your new boss." The weight of those words sent a shockwave through the showroom. Employees stared, some in shock, others trying and failing to hide their amusement. Greg's heart pounded. He had known. He had sensed something was off. And for the first time since he'd met her, Madeline looked truly afraid. The silence was suffocating. No one moved. No one spoke. Madeline blinked rapidly, her mind scrambling for footing. This had to be a mistake, a joke. The man standing before her, the one she had just humiliated, couldn't possibly be her new CEO. And yet, Elliot had said it out loud. In front of everyone, Jordan let the realization settle before speaking again. "I have to say," he mused, tilting his head slightly, "I expected to get a sense of how this dealership operates today." A pause. "I didn't expect this." Madeline's stomach twisted. She had been in sales for over 2 decades. She had handled difficult clients, high-pressure negotiations, VIPs who expected the world. But this was something else entirely. Elliot finally seemed to pick up on the tension, glancing between them. "Wait, what happened?" Jordan didn't answer right away. He let the silence stretch. Jordan watched Madeline like a teacher observing a student about to fail. Then, with a casual turn, he faced Greg. "What's your name?" Greg's throat was dry. Greg, sir." Jordan nodded. "Been here long?" 3 years. 3 years, Jordan chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Let me ask you something, Greg. If I had walked in here today wearing a suit, saying the exact same words, would I have needed to pull out my credit card just to be taken seriously?" Greg hesitated. He knew the answer. Everyone did. But saying it out loud? That could cost him his job. Jordan seemed to sense the struggle, and gave a slight nod. "You don't have to answer that." Then he turned back to Madeline. She had regained some composure, but her usual sharp confidence had faded, replaced by uncertainty. "Mr. Ellis," she began, her voice smooth and practiced, the way people talk when trying to contain damage. "I truly apologize if there was any misunderstanding." "Misunderstanding?" Jordan lifted a brow. "That's what you're going with?" Madeline forced a chuckle, but it fell flat. "I was just following store policy. We have strict guidelines for test-driving luxury models. I would have handled any customer the same way." Jordan studied her for a moment, then turned to Elliot. "Elliot," he said casually, "when did Hamilton Prestige Motors start requiring a soft credit check before a customer could even sit inside a car?" Elliot frowned. "We don't." The last thread of Madeline's defense snapped. Jordan let the truth sink in, watching her. He hadn't raised his voice, hadn't caused a scene. Somehow, that made it worse. Madeline's palms were damp. For the first time, she felt it. She was no longer in control, and Jordan wasn't done. Her throat tightened as she searched for an explanation, an escape, anything to undo the last few minutes. But there was no undoing it. Jordan tilted his head slightly, his gaze patient, like someone who had already won. "So just to be clear," he said, voice calm, deliberate, "you refused to sell me a car because I didn't look like someone who could afford it?" Madeline opened her mouth, but Jordan wasn't finished. "You made assumptions. You dismissed me. You lied about company policy, and when I called you out, you doubled down." He exhaled through his nose, shaking his head slightly. "Tell me, Madeline, what does a serious customer look like to you?" The words hit like a punch. She scrambled for footing, forcing a tight smile. "Mr. Ellis, that wasn't my intent at all. We have high standards here, and I was simply ensuring those standards." Jordan raised a brow. "High standards?" Madeline stammered. Greg, Jared, and the other employees stood frozen, watching their manager unravel. Elliot cleared his throat, stepping in. "Jordan, obviously this isn't how we want any of our customers treated." "I'm not a customer," Jordan said coolly. "I'm the CEO, and I just watched my own sales manager decide, on site, who does and doesn't belong here." The room fell silent. Madeline felt the blood drain from her face. She had always carried a sense of untouchability, knew the business inside and out, had been here for years, built a reputation for getting results. None of that mattered now. Jordan turned back to her, his expression unreadable. "I came here undercover for a reason," he said, "to see how our customers are treated, to see if the values we claim to uphold are actually followed." He paused. I've seen enough. Madeline's chest tightened. I understand your concern, she tried, voice unsteady. But surely, we can talk about this. I've been a valuable part of this company for years. I've closed deals no one else could. My track record speaks for itself. Jordan studied her for a long moment, then nodded. You're right, he said. Your track record does speak for itself. A flicker of relief crossed her face, until he added, That's why you're done here. Madeline froze. For the first time in her career, she had no words. Jordan's voice remained steady. I don't run a company that turns people away based on appearances. If that's a problem for you, then this was never the place for you to begin with. The air felt thick, heavy. The employees exchanged uneasy glances, but no one defended her. Elliot exhaled, rubbing his temple. He wasn't going to fight it. Madeline swallowed hard, her body rigid. Jordan waited, but for the first time in her life. She had nothing left to say, and with that, the conversation was over. Madeline stood frozen. Everything she had built, everything she had worked for, gone, just like that. The weight of the moment settled in, pressing against her chest like a vice. She wanted to fight back, to argue, to plead her case, but deep down, she knew. There was no talking her way out of this. She had done this to herself. The employees remained silent. Some stole glances at each other, while others stared at the floor. No one stepped forward to defend her. And Jordan. He didn't gloat. He didn't raise his voice. He simply watched her, with the quiet understanding of a man who had seen this happen before. Finally, he turned to Elliot. We need to have a conversation about the hiring and training process, he said. This isn't about one employee. It's about the culture we allow. Elliot nodded slowly, rubbing his chin. Understood. Jordan's gaze swept across the showroom. I'll be personally reviewing how things are run here, he said. Some things are going to change. Greg exhaled slowly, feeling the tension shift for the first time. For once, it felt like someone in charge actually cared. Jordan then turned back to Madeline one last time. I hope this is a lesson, he said, because the real loss here isn't just your job. It's the opportunity to be better, to do better. Madeline's jaw tightened, but she remained silent. Jordan gave a single nod. Good luck. And with that, he walked away, leaving her standing there alone. As he exited the showroom, the employees finally began to move. The air felt lighter. Different, as if a shift had taken place, Greg exchanged a glance with Jared, a silent understanding passing between them. This wasn't just about one bad manager. It was about how people are treated, about how power and assumptions can shape an entire workplace. Jordan had walked in expecting to see a business in action. Instead, he had uncovered a problem much larger than one person. It's easy to assume, easy to judge people based on appearances, on first impressions. But how often do we stop and question our own biases? Madeline thought she knew who belonged and who didn't. She thought she was in control. But in the end, the only thing she controlled was her own downfall. If this story made you think, even for a second, share it. Let's start conversations that matter. And if you haven't yet, subscribe for more stories that challenge the way we see the world, because the smallest decisions can have the biggest consequences.